today's topics look like this. We're going to spend, I'm going to spend a decent, not too much, but I want to make sure that we all ground ourselves in some context. So we're going to start talking about some basic concepts, some context for today, look into why these ideas might be something that you want to think about, and then how I went about and still go about building and using these ideas for teams that I work with, for those who are interested in it, obviously. And then I'll show you some real world examples as well. Okay, so I've got pictures that I've taken over the years of some ideas that teams have actually used. We'll talk briefly about some results and benefits, and that should bring us right up to the Q&A, where we'll have some time to do that as well. If I speak, or if I'm talking a little bit fast, there is a lot of material in here, not a lot of slides so much, but a lot of material that I want to make sure we cover. But if I'm going too fast, and if anyone wants me to slow down or go over something, please let me know. So I'd like to start with going back to what today's topic is. And I want to make sure we ground ourselves in some of these words and some of these concepts. So the first one I want to talk about there in red is, what do I mean by ready? And within this context, I mean the definition of ready, and we'll show that in a minute. But lots of times teams, you should have a definition of ready. A definition of ready is the criteria in which the team has agreed that, this user story or this work item has met before we do anything further with it. Usually before we pull it into a sprint or before we actually, quote, work on it. We'll talk about what that means. But for now, we'll just leave it at that. That's what I mean by ready within the title of this presentation. Unhiding work. What I mean by that is, I have found that many Scrum teams in particular have a lot of work that they do that's what I'll call hidden. All right. It's nowhere to necessarily be seen. It's not up on a board. It may not be in your favorite tool, but it's there. And we know it's there through the conversations that we hear. I'll talk about that through observations that we have. So how do we go about unhiding that work? Well, lots of times that unhiding the work that I'm talking about tends to be work that I'm going to say is backlog refinement work. It's work that is in our backlog, and it's in this process of refining. And how can we go about unhiding that work? Well, no surprise, maybe we should find some ways to visualize that. And we can do that through what I call a backlog refinement board. And we'll see some examples later. There are other things that teams have called this in the past. So let's talk just briefly about definition of ready. Again, we're still within context here. The 2020 Scrum Guide doesn't explicitly call out a DOR or a definition of ready, but they do mention that our PBIs, or backlog items, those items that need to get done within a sprint need to be ready. So they need to be ready to be able to be pulled into a sprint. So they don't come out explicitly with a definition. A friend of mine, an agile coach down below, through his book, and you could Google this and you'll find lots of definitions like this. It's that criteria that a user story or a work item must have before you want to bring it into a sprint. So that's what I'm thinking about. That's what I'm talking about when I say ready. And when we talk about product backlog, again, the 2020 Scrum Guide, or the product backlog refinement, the Scrum Guide, they do talk a little bit about it. I'll read it quickly, but it's the act of breaking down and further defining these PBIs that you have. You have a backlog and you want to break things down. And it's an ongoing activity, and that's key here. It's an ongoing activity to add details and assumptions, acceptance criteria, whatever you feel or your team feels is necessary to get it to that ready state. Okay. So we're probably all familiar with a graphic that looks like this. This is the standard Scrum Framework graphic. We have our Scrum events there in blue with the asterisks. We have our artifacts that are in red, the backlog, the sprint backlog, the increment. And typically when I work with teams, the area that you see in pink here is the area that teams right away go to create a Scrum board of some sort with, whether it's a physical board, and I miss those days of physical boards pre-pandemic, or in Jira, or whatever your favorite tool happens to be, or tool you have to use happens to be, we tend to create the work around this notion of the sprint. We have our sprint backlog. That's the items that have been brought into the sprint. We're going to work on those items with our 2-week cadence, typically 2 weeks. We have our stand-up. And then, of course, what comes out of that sprint is our increment. And we'll do our retros and our sprint review around that. But it's that pink area that we tend to think about most often when we think the model our work visually. But what I want to really talk about today is what's to the left of that pink area. I want to really look at, well, what's going on with this arrow here? We have our product backlog. We have this arrow. And I'm going to put this dark black line there with, I'm going to say, we're going to take a little bit of a leap to say, between that arrow and between what we're used to showing visually is probably where our definition of ready needs to sit, right? So something is happening between the product backlog before we bring it into a sprint. At least something should be happening, okay? And that's probably your backlog refinement. And we probably have a DOR, a definition of ready, that sits in there somewhere. So let's take this a little bit further. There's the same graphic up at the top that you just saw. And for the purpose of today's discussion, I'm going to visualize our standard Scrum board as a simple to-do, doing, done board. By no means does it have to be that. Does not have to be that. But I will, because I was running out of space, quite honestly. We're going to show that as to-do, doing, done, okay? But so the pink up above matches the pink down below. We have a visual board of some sort, whether it's physical or in Jira or whatever your tool is. And then the area that's in blue is what today's talk is going to be about. That blue arrow that you see at top, I'm kind of showing down below, is I have helped teams with their backlog refinement by creating what I'll call a backlog refinement board, a way to visualize the steps that are necessary to get your work items from that backlog through backlog refinement, meeting that definition of ready so that you can bring it in. So you can see where I'm talking about from the Scrum Framework graphic up above to down below. And we're going to talk a lot about that blue area today. Still in context, I do want to bring out another concept that's very important to understand. This is taken from the Kanban guide for Scrum teams, a document I highly recommend that you read, especially if you're a Scrum team, because the flow of work is a very, very important concept, not just for what we might think as Kanban teams, but also for Scrum teams. Everybody works with a context of flow of work in some way or another. It's so important that the Kanban guide for Scrum teams says, hey, Scrum team, you need to recognize that, flow is the movement of value through your product development system. A Scrum team needs to recognize that they have that too. They need to define what flow means for them as well. Okay, so this is another important concept to understand what we're going to be talking about today. Okay. So what I say is when we put this backlog refinement board, and we're going to talk a lot about how we get to this picture, but I want to throw this up now, how we get to this backlog refinement board, along with your traditional Scrum board, all of that is your workflow. For those Agile coaches out there and Scrum masters out there, or really anyone, we need to recognize that all of this is considered a workflow. All of this is your workflow. Okay. So that's what I mean by that flow of work and what we're doing. So once we have this kind of as our context, and I went through it kind of quickly here, let's talk next about why, and some things that I have seen over the years, and why, and maybe you do too, why a refinement board may be something that you'd like to consider. Okay, so we'll be talking about these 4 items. So this morning when I woke up, I was laying there and I was thinking about this slide, because the word confusion, it's like, do I really like the word confusion over where team members are working? I know what I want to say. Maybe you can help me think of a better word over this confusion, but I'm going to stick with it for now. But what I mean here is I can't tell you the number of times that I have worked with teams standing in front of their traditional Scrum board. And typically, it looks something like this. You'll have your Scrum Master, you have your developer and your tester and DBAs. And I recognize these are not the traditional 3 roles of Scrum. Just give me a little leeway here. But the people, your cross-functional individuals necessary to get that work to done. Okay, so whatever those roles may be for your particular team. Generally, it's these roles that you typically hear the most. Okay, they're in front of their Scrum board. Oops, wrong way. And typically, the people who generally do the backlog refinement think a lot about getting things to ready. It's not that they're not part of your daily stand-up, and it's certainly not part of that they are not part of your sprint board and working there, but they do spend a lot of time grooming stories or refining stories and getting those stories ready for the following subsequent sprints that are happening. Usually those roles are product owner and the analysts. Certainly here in my current client that's the case. But the confusion, or if you can think of a better word, is there are lots of times when I begin to hear language around, especially developers and testers, saying things like, I can't do my real work because the analyst needs me to check something out that's technical, and they need me. And really what you begin seeing and hearing are situations that look like this, where the tester and the developer is working what I'll call upstream from that definition of ready, or upstream in backlog refinement. And they're needed up there. But you hear things like, I can't do my real work, or they even get nervous that they can't show that they're doing their real work down in the doing, if you will, or the execution of the work in their normal sprint, their Scrum board, their sprint work down there. And what happens is a lot of things can happen. I mean, you get nervous players, especially if you work in an environment that's very top down. They might feel that they're not being accounted for the work that they're actually doing. There's no visual or visible way to show that they are doing something. But if that something is only reflected downstream in their sprint work, there's no way to show that something is occurring someplace else. Okay. And a couple other things. You may witness this too, or you may hear these cues as well as you're standing there in the stand-up or something like that. And so by having a refinement board, or at least a way to visually identify those items that are occurring more upstream, having a refinement board can do that. And when you stand there, and again, we'll talk about this later on, but when you stand there for your stand-up and you can see everything in front of you and know where people are going so you can coordinate that day's activity, less confusion happens. There's more understanding of who's where and what's happening. You may also notice, as number 2, refinement taking place during a sprint. How many times have we noticed during our sprints that teams are looking at this user story or this work item, and you hear things like, what is this thing again? Or what's happening with this? Or is this really what the acceptance criteria should be? They're questioning it. Perhaps they haven't done as good of a job of meeting that definition already as they should have done. You may notice that they're taking the entire sprint to finish, or they're not finishing that user story or that work item at all, or perhaps even they're pulling it out of the sprint. By having a backlog refinement board, this is another way that you can be more methodical in getting those things that are necessary towards your DOR, towards your definition of ready, so that you're not suffering through that refinement process happening during your sprint. Okay, so if you're noticing refinement taking place in the sprint, maybe they really shouldn't be there yet in the sprint. By being more methodical, by being more deliberate, we can show that it needs to happen more upstream. Number 3, work items really belong upstream as part of a refinement. So this is what I mean by that. My current, a couple years ago, they had their Scrum board, and I began to hear language around this concept of what the teams called analysis stories. And me and another coach, we began, this perked our ears. What is an analysis story? They had a more traditional value delivered user story, if you will, something that was purposeful and would benefit a customer. But they also had these items called analysis stories. So upon querying them a little bit more, like, what is this analysis story? What is this thing? And they said, well, these are work items that allow us to do analysis so that we can understand what this feature that's coming down the road is all about. What's this feature? We need to take this feature, we need to split it up eventually, but we don't even understand what this feature is. And we need a developer to do this work, or we need somebody else to do this work. And so they were putting it down here. But upon further investigation, it wasn't a story that represented value. It was really work that was in support of future user stories. It was really work that belonged more upstream. They were steps. Perhaps it belonged to whatever your column 2 step was, or the policies that helped govern that backlog refinement board. But they were really representative of refinement work towards getting user stories created. So we worked with these teams and said, let's not put them down here, especially if you've got developers working on it, developers working, and helping with the analysts and everything. Going back to my first point, let's move this, let's create something more upstream. Tell us about what that looks like and see if we can move this item more to the left, because you're really talking about supporting a user story that you eventually want to create. So if you notice this with your teams, this could be another sign why a refinement board might be for you. And lastly, number 4, the team not knowing where they are in a refinement process. I don't know about you, but there are times when I join refinement meetings, and granted, they're not a standard Scrum event, but they still do happen, where you hear people talking, like, where did we leave off again? Or what's going on with refinement? Or what do we still need to do? And lots of times too, especially during COVID, our backlog, as shown here by these yellow, work items, is very vertical. The items that are down below, or they're bigger, they're unknown, they're more complex, they're, maybe 3 or 4 sprints down the road. They're just bigger in concept. But as we go up this backlog, these items become more refined. And I've kind of shown that here by having the big items down below, medium items in the middle, and the items up above being smaller indicating refined. And lots of trainings even may show a backlog that looks something like this. Okay. The reason why I bring all this up and what does it mean to be in the refinement process? Because we've been so used to thinking of backlogs as very vertically stacked, I like to think of our backlogs as looking maybe something more like this, where along with that refinement board, we're kind of tilting that backlog horizontally, where the more refined items, no surprise, are probably further to the right, if you will, of your backlog refinement board. The middle items, bigger items, are probably in the middle. And maybe the real big items, the things that we don't even know yet, haven't even been brought into refinement. And when you have something like this, and you walk into the meeting, your refinement meeting, with this visual there, now you begin to understand, oh, this is where this particular item is. It's almost ready. This is what we need to do with it yet. And that's going to be governed by your policies that talk about the board, and I'll talk about that in a minute. This item it's newer to the refinement board, and we're still doing some preliminary work on it. But I have found that by having this horizontal way of looking at your backlog and where it is in the steps of getting to ready, it really allows the team to know better where they are in their refinement process. Now, let's talk about what are some steps that you might like. These are steps that I like, that you might like to build and ultimately use that backlog refinement board with your teams. Well, no surprise, where I like to start off is talking with the team and having them begin to think about, you are working in a workflow. Let's first talk about the refinement workflow. And when I say team, I do mean everyone on the team. I try. I want everyone there because everyone has, going back to my number one that we talked about earlier, everyone does play a role in that refinement process, in those refinement steps. But before I could immediately create a board, I like to meet with the team and just say, tell me about the logical sequence of steps that you take. If you know that your goal is to say, hey, this work item is ready for sprint planning, tell me about what is it that you typically do to get there. And in this room, a room like this with whiteboards, I like to, get out my pen, and we begin to kind of just map it out, kind of like you see here with the gray boxes. What's the first main thing that you do? The first thing, that you typically do. What's the next thing that you do? And if there's any decision points in there, hey, let's put those in there as well. Let's just have a discussion and let's include everyone. This is not a trivial step. This is not a half-hour meeting. This can take several hours, quite frankly. But it's important to have something that everyone understands and that is established as this is what refinement means to us. And part of that conversation is capturing the criteria that goes into the decisions. How do you know when you've moved from this main step to this next main step, if you will? What are you looking for? What questions are you trying to answer? What's going on in this decision point? What happens here that you would, take this and move it back to a previous step? What's going on there? I like to understand what all this criteria is, because all of this is eventually going to be your refinement board and the policies that help govern that refinement board. Okay, so the policies it's a fancy word of saying, these are the rules, these are the criteria that need to exist before I move from one step in my flow to the next step. And not until those criteria are addressed and answered, do I really want to pull that item into the next step in my refinement board. Okay, so this can take a long time. I'm only talking about it for a minute and a half here, but this can be a several-hour meeting to get everyone on board to really understand these are the steps that we need to get to ready. All right, so now we have that backlog, better yet, now we have those steps. And it's a little bit of a gray area, I'll be honest with you. Taking what you've got here to getting to here, you've got to figure that out. You've got to work with your team and figure that out. What is going to be our first column based on what we talked about here? What's our next column? We've got our policies now that help govern those steps and those decision points so that we understand this is what I expect to be happening before I pull things in next. But next is visualizing the entire workflow. Let's build something so that we can begin to take that flow and make a board, if you will, out of that. And what I like to do as best as I can, it was a little tricky during COVID, is I like to put that refinement board right next to our Scrum board. Okay, I'll show you some examples of this, but right next to it. Okay. And again, I like them to think about this is your imaginary, at least your definition of ready probably sits in between these two areas. And of course, I always like to stress, team, this is your workflow. All of this is your workflow. Let's recognize that and let's begin to appreciate that we are needed everywhere from left to right to get our stories ultimately to done. So visualizing it right next to the Scrum board if you can. Not always easy where I work right now during COVID because of situations that I'll explain in a little bit. Okay, the next step. Let's manage the refinement workflow, managing the refinement workflow. One of the things that I like to stress when teams are beginning to think about their entire workflow here, and especially with refinement, is though your sprint and your Scrum board may be or should be in a 2-week, let's say 2-week iterations, your backlog refinement board does not have to be that. You can decouple your cadences. You can have 2 weeks down here or whatever your favorite cadence is for sprints. But up here, it doesn't have to be, and upstream doesn't have to be. And in fact, you probably don't want it to be either for the reasons that we talked about earlier. A lot of these items are new. they're unknown, they're uncertain, you probably have a decent amount of work to refine them. So as they make their way down the refinement board, of course, they're going to be getting smaller. Maybe things split off in some way or another, but you're addressing all the criteria that you see down below. And ultimately, when it gets to that definition of ready, you can now ideally bring things in for sprint planning, whether it's the immediate next sprint planning, like just in time, or if it's 2 or 3 sprint plannings, perhaps in the future. But you don't necessarily need to manage that work every 2 weeks, and like it must get done every 2 weeks. Now, obviously, if you need to manage a particular item in backlog refinement to be ready for a specific date or a specific sprint, great. Now you at least have a board that you can put the date on there. This got to be ready by, March 8th. But at least you have that information and you know where it is in refinement so that you can begin to manage towards that. Lastly, using the workflow. We're very used to our stand-ups looking something like this. We've got all the necessary people that we have in front of our Scrum board. But now our stand-ups look like this. We have the entire flow in front of the team. And now the team can see everything that they're working on. And if where I'm needed upstream, that's fine. I'll talk about what's going upstream. If I'm needed down here, that's fine. I'll talk about what's going down here. But we recognize and we appreciate that all of this is the workflow. And especially for those people that are a little skittish about not doing their real work, I like to coach them and say, my coaching technique, I should say, is that all of this is your real work. All of this is. And if you're needed, wherever you're needed, let's put your name, let's put your icon, whatever it is, on that specific work item where you are, so that when we have our stand-up, we can now coordinate today's events based on what we're seeing. We're used over here, we're going over here, but we can make our day's decisions, our goals for today based on everything that we have now visualized. Okay. And yes, this still can be done in 15 minutes. This doesn't mean we have an extra 15 minutes to a stand-up. You can still do all of this in your standard 15-minute stand-up. So that's how I like teams to think about using their workflow. All right, let's take a look at some real-world examples here. I'm going to start kind of basic and go up to things that are a little more advanced. So during COVID, I was working with the team, and because of where I work right now, we cannot create an upstream refinement board in the tool that we currently use, which is Jira. We can't do it. It's because of the organization. It cannot be done. So we turned to Mural to create an upstream flow. And yes, things are blurred out just so that you couldn't read it. But what was important is what you see in the gray boxes up above. And these were the rules. This was the flow and the necessary rules that this particular team created, made sense to them, for the items that you see. And I can't remember pink, purple, and green items that you see down below. But this was the work that was ultimately leading to, as you can see in the far right column there, ready for planning. Okay, so their stand-ups looked a little like this. We were all at home, we're all on our calls. We started off looking at Jira, and then the Scrum Master changed the screen from Jira to go to Mural, which is an online whiteboarding application, to go to Mural and look at what was happening. And there was a little bit of toggling back and forth, admittedly so. It was a little weird at first. But the cost of doing that was far lower than the benefits that they received from just having that better view of what was happening. Here's another example of pre-COVID, what this particular team called a discovery board. And you can see that their steps here were collaboration and research, architect synthesizing, refining, and hey, we're ready to build. And in here were the steps that were appropriate for them to understand when they would move these items over from left to right. And it's a little tricky to read, but you can see this green one. I think it's some really good stuff. We've got the user story defined. We have it prioritized. We have acceptance criteria. Whatever steps and whatever criteria is needed, is what they have written out here. So they knew when they could pull these pink items from left to right to get ready to build. And here they happen to call it a discovery board. And you can see even at the far left, it's just this almost generic term. This is an idea that we have. We don't know if it's going to work or not. It's just an idea. And so they refine it through getting things to ready. Here's another one I'll walk you through. This is something that I helped with right before COVID. Everything that you see with tape here, and I don't have all of it, but everything that you see with tape here was the Scrum board. It was a physical Scrum board. It also existed in Jira as well, but it wasn't cutting it, especially for the product owner. The product owner was one of these people who was confused of where they were. They couldn't just manage where they were. They had so many items. Everything that you see to the left of this tape here is their refinement work. Now, what you see here was many iterations of refining this board. Okay, so this was not just a one and done meeting that we had. Nonetheless, you can see that here's their backlog. You can think of these pink items as future user stories in the making, or maybe not. You can also discard things. But down below in these yellow cards here, index cards, these were their policies. So each of these describes the work that was going on in this initial assessment doing column. Down here, you can't read it, but down here was all the rules that they had before they would say, okay, that's done. Let's move it into done. Next step was something called prep work. They had concurrent processes here. So we built a board where you build one on top of the other, a step on top of each other. One was called mockups. One was called create gherkin. They brought the card up here. They split things out in between here because this work and this work could both happen at the same time. And then when they were both done, we joined them again and then brought them down to here. So ready for grooming. But as you can see, as they moved these items from left to right, they were headed towards this ready for planning. And once the card got to here, this pink sticky got to here, it was ready for sprint planning. It was ready to be brought into the next sprint. Now, some of you may be asking, this is great, but where is all this work going? How are they recording this work? Well, they were still recording all this work in Jira. It just happened to be sitting in the backlog section of Jira, the backlog area of Jira. So for example, let's say this particular story here, this one right here that I'm circling, 1, 2, 3, 4, we'll say it's the number 1, 2, 3, 4 in Jira. As they learn more about 1, 2, 3, 4, the analyst would go into Jira and they would type in the acceptance criteria or the assumptions, or they would attach documents or whatever they needed to do. They would still record it in Jira in the backlog, but they had a visual way via this board to actually show what all this work was that they were actually accumulating through this refinement process. Okay. And of course, getting it ready for planning. Once COVID hit, the Scrum Master turned this board into this. And again, they used Mural to obviously show what the board looked like because we were all now working from home. They also refined it a little bit more. They added a couple other steps to their concurrent process portion. They've, in this RFP, which is ready for planning, they've broken things out. Well, these are the items that were ready for planning of the sprint 20.4.4 versus 20.4.5 versus 20.4.6. So they've obviously added to how they wanted to work with this. But again, their stand-ups when I would attend, they'd start with Jira because that was their Scrum board and it had to be in that for purposes of the organization that we worked. But we would toggle to the refinement board in here. And sometimes we had people, we had developers and testers talking about work they were doing here as well. But it was a way to just manage everything that was coming from the backlog all the way through to ready for planning. Some results and benefits that you may experience, I know I have, and some of these actually came from teams that have done this and have come back to me. One that I liked, I put at the top, is feedback that I got was, Mark, we were able to get to ready much more confidently. I thought that was just a great way of phrasing it. I really liked how he said that. We feel so much more confident getting to definition of ready so that when sprint planning came, we knew this item was ready to be talked about. Okay. People have found refinements more engaging. I think that speaks to being able to visualize it and see where we are and what's going on and what our policies are, that we're able to talk about it more. And of course, whenever you talk about flow, you can see where bottlenecks occur. This is a very flow-based way of thinking about things. But if things are bunching up in a particular area, hey, there's a bottleneck here. What's going on? We can immediately go to it. Might be harder to see that if we keep things very vertically in a backlog. I've heard smaller user stories have come out of this when they brought it into sprints because they were able to refine things and they knew what they were refining. They also had a better sense of things were getting too big and they wanted to split a story or break it down in some manner. They were able to do that. And some of the other things that you see here were some benefits and results.